I am Lucas Linder, and this is my, final capstone video project for philosophy, and it's on Christianity, happiness, and the meaning of life. So to get right into it, and starting with the Christianity view, talked about in Jesus the Great Philosopher by Pennington, um, and to point out the things from his argument that stood out to me. The first quote that stuck out to me was on page 205, which is Christianity is a philosophy of happiness because it is based on the Bible, and the Bible is constantly addressing these same grand questions of meaning and happiness. Um, and what that's kind of doing is, in terms of how the Bible relates to happiness, is that the Bible is a guide toward happiness. So the Bible is the Word of God. And reading it and spending time in it help people, us, to know God and give us the knowledge and hope we have now and for the future, helping us seek and to know happiness in the present and also know the future glorification that's coming. The second quote that stuck out to me was on page 210, which is, "It was for the joy that set before him that he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Jesus was motivated by his own future happiness. Um, and what this kind of pointed out to me and why it stuck out was that, um, and I kind of just touched on this earlier, but we find happiness in future glorification. So, in our actions and suffering now, we can and need to look at God um, to have hope in the future, and as such, see happiness and joy in our suffering now. Um, Knowing our future glorification that's coming, it helps us to 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 have a godly perspective, um, a godly perspective, a godly viewpoint in a sense, and see the happiness in it now that we might not otherwise see on our own. The third quote that stuck out to me is on page 211, which is, um, "Where is flourishing all of this?" Speaking about the chaos of the world. It is found in glimpses when people turn to God, lifting their eyes from earth to heaven. So, what that's kind of getting at is when we turn to God, we find happiness. Um, and kind of where that relates is believers find happiness and flourishing when they look to God, when we look to God. God in his power, majesty, goodness, and faithfulness brings true happiness and flourishing to us when we focus on, look to, and rely on him. And that kind of, I think, puts God at the center of it all. Um, Putting God at the center of our happiness. No, it's not something we can achieve on our own, but something that he gives, that he freely gives to us. Um, and something that, like we might be able to find on earth. Fleeting happiness, something that lasts a short time, but God gives us true, lasting, fulfilling happiness. Um, so the fourth quote that stuck out to me was on page 215. It is that the good life is a life of brokenness and joy, of love and loss, all empowered by sure hope. Um, and what that gets at is finding happiness in the hope we have for God, not just looking at the present, um, or not just looking at the good and pleasurable, but the good and flourishing Christian life is found not only in joy, but also in our brokenness and suffering because of the future hope we have in the coming glory and consummation, the second coming of Christ. So what that is, it kind of takes our perspective off of our here and now and looking at what we know is coming. Again, kind of giving a godly perspective, a future meaning to the suffering we endure now. Um, and the last quote that stuck out to me was on page 220, and it is that um, true happiness is found in the way of Jesus, and that flourishing life is a complex cocktail that must be drunk in its fullness to feel its effect. Sad, fruitful, broken, true. And this is that happiness is simply found in the way of Jesus, both joy and suffering. Um, so, and kind of just to go into that again, like true happiness is simply found in the way of Jesus. That is why sanctification is important as we conform to his image and do as he did. This furthermore means that true happiness is found both in suffering and in joy, when in all we do and go through, we focus on God, serving Him, being God-centered. And I think, kind of to overall summarize that, like, happiness doesn't just come from us. Like, it's not something like that's something found from God, and that true and fulfilling happiness. Let's put it. comes from when we put God at the center and rely on Him in all that we do, um, and seeking Him first. That is where true happiness is found. So, of the opposing views, or I don't want to say against, but of the opposing or of the differing views to the Christian view on flourishing and happiness in life is hedonism, and then after this, stoicism. Um, so what hedonism gets at, and that's I pulled a quote from Ray, is that happiness is a result of how much pleasure and pain we experience. And two kind of advocates, or two different versions of this, but two hedonists were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So Jeremy Bentham supported and followed the quantitative version, which calculates pleasure or pain on one scale and values the amount of pleasurable events. Um, so he had 7 aspects of pleasure to that: intensity, duration, certainty, nearness, fruitfulness, purity, and extent. And of those, that would be how he measures if an event is pleasurable. And it was just like it's just one scale, and you're just trying to get as much pleasure as humanly as possible. Whereas Mill, on the other hand, um, kind of created and followed the qualitative version, which is there are higher pleasures that are intrinsically superior to lower ones. So higher pleasures, in his opinion, were like friendship, intelligence, freedom, knowledge, and love and ability, where lower pleasures were eating, drinking, sexuality, and resting. And his argument was that those higher pleasures could bring something that the lower pleasures couldn't. And as such, the higher pleasures should be sought before the lower ones. Where Bentham um, was kind of like, if you did enough of the lower pleasures, it would equal out. Um, it would equal out in the end, so it didn't really matter. And Mill was against that. Um, but overall, like how hedonism fits into the Christianity argument is hedonism seeks pleasure and the absence of pain. That's it. However that happens, no matter what, that's like that, it is what it is. Um, and it creates a very self-centered view, much I think that's similar to Stoicism in a ways. It makes it very self-centered in terms of um, people are looking, how do I get happiness, and then um, how to maximize my own happiness and not looking at others or looking at a divine force um, in that aspect. Um, and I also think it's very short lived. I mean, just having to, either qualitative or quantitative, you wake up every day thinking, how do I find the most pleasure? And how do I go do something? And I feel like that would be very burdensome to think that you always have to go do something. Um, and then to get into Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius and um, a picture below that. But Stoicism basically finds happiness in its contentment and tranquility. Um, well, that gets in how Marcus Aurelius gets into that is that it's only found inside, developing the inner self. Um, and to go more in depth on that, and more in depth on what Stoicism exactly says, it is that change is basic, death is certain. So where do we find happiness, flourishing, tranquility? The only place is inside us, because the only thing we can control is ourselves. We cannot control the rest of the world, so we cannot find consistent and true happiness in the world. We must look within ourselves. Again, kind of this self-centeredness, you must look inside. Um, hedonism more so looks at, how do I make the outside, conform to me? How do I make, um, how do I just find happiness? If it's with circumstances or not, like that's not really a part of it. Where Stoicism really looks on, okay, look inside yourself to find happiness. And what Marcus Aurelius gets into is discipline and practical life. So the discipline of assent, finding truth, discipline of desire, finding tranquility, and the discipline of action, finding justice. Um, and to go into more in depth on each of those. So for truth, Aurelius talks about redescribing and reframing things so as to define them rightly as what they are, seeing things for what they truly are, to be truly content with them. Again, bringing happiness with that is seeing things as they truly are. Um, Bringing lasting and actual true happiness, not just fleeting or something that isn't real. Um, in tranquility, Aurelius gets into personal attachments being replaced by an admiration of nature and the providence at work, not consuming but admiring things for what they are. Um, that is a little that does go away from self-centeredness in terms of um, in terms of just admiring things and not just attaching yourself to them. Um, and it also gets into like in terms of providence, like clinging to that which is unshakable. So clinging to providence and cooperating with providence, cooperate with what comes in life and embrace fate, finding joy in it. Um, Kind of like taking the circumstances that come and just dealing with them as they come, like not like recognizing the lack of control you have, which is something I would agree in a sense. And then for the last thing, for justice, what Aurelius gets into is loving all people, rational creatures, with a sacred detachment, being fully present to them and who they are and what made them so, cooperating with them instead of competing with them. Um, that really does get into serving others, at least in terms of you're not judging them, but you're loving them no matter what, and you're being present with them, not just kind of seeking your own agenda, but actually looking at them for who they are and trying to know them. Um, and what goes along with that is like cultivating constant mercy and gentleness and teaching others with benevolence and patience. Um, Kind of, I would say both of those are um, eh, Christian aspects too. Like you want to cultivate mercy and gentleness in a Christian life, um, and you want to teach others with benevolence and patience. Like I feel like that would be something embodied by Jesus. Um, but kind of overall and summarize like Stoicism, like people like you're supposed to focus on controlling and disciplining yourself, basically mastering yourself. Um, which again, I feel like it is different from hedonism in a way that it does bring up other people in terms of loving them and that being a way to find happiness. Again, that's kind of like controlling yourself. Um, but I still feel like it puts the self at the center, which is what I would disagree with on that end. Um, Kind of and kind of the picture I to have here, along with Aurelius, is like basically in mastering yourself, you're escaping from the chaos of the world. Which again, I don't. Again, that's something I feel like also goes against Christianity in terms of like we're not called to escape the chaos. We're not called to we're called to live in the world, but not of the world. So we have to be a part of that chaos in order to fill out the mission of Jesus and what we're called to do. So my thoughts, as I've talked about kind of throughout here, is that I prefer a Christian view. Um, Seeking lasting happiness, I think that hedonism or stoicism aren't going to bring through um, lasting and fulfilling happiness. At least not that it will last, because like with hedonism, you're just seeking pleasure every day. I think that, like in my opinion, I think that would get old. I also think it would get very tiring to do that. And again, I think it's putting the self at the center. Um, Stoicism, um, if my like in my life experience is any in my life experience, like controlling yourself only goes so far. Like there's only so much you can do on your own. And I think there would be an end to stoicism where it's like, what else are you supposed to do? Like you try and fail. Like where are you supposed to go with that? And I feel like in Christianity, like what I found in my life is lasting happiness, a lasting hope in God, and a lasting happiness and almost a lasting peace, knowing that um, I can't do it, but He's with me, knowing that God is with me, um, and knowing God's work in my life. Like that has brought me peace and I think tranquility and happiness. Um, and that goes along with the second point, like not knowing that my pursuit of happiness, pursuing happiness is not only by my own means. It's not just how far I can get on my own, um, but where God can take me and what God wants me to do. Um, Relying on God and His limitlessness, knowing that He can get me and He can take me to far more fulfilling happiness than I could ever even hope to attain. Not just in the present, in the next point, not just hope for the present, but hope for the future. Um, Having hope that I know that God is with me now, is providing for me now, um, but also the hope in the future and future glorification, and not only that, but like that glorification in hope that better is coming and that eventually I'll see God, see Him face to face. Yeah, that's a very hopeful thought. And I thought, and to get into kind of Christianity versus Stoicism, because I thought Stoicism was the second best view we studied. Um, what my main knock with Stoicism, was excuse me, I felt that Stoicism put the self at the center, where Christianity put gods and others at the center. Um, and to go more in depth on that, like I believe Christianity is better than Stoicism. Um, because while Stoicism has many advantages, advantageous views, because it can become very self-centered. And while self-care is important, that's something that's even talked about in the Bible. Self-care is important. When made the focus in the center, it can very easily become selfishness, which I believe does not lead to lasting and true happiness. I believe that true and lasting happiness comes in following the example of Jesus, which means being God-centered and focusing your life on serving Him and serving others, while in which leading to and giving true happiness will involve suffering and hardships, along with joy and happiness. Like one of the, like the big like I think the biggest failings in most, especially in hedonism and stoicism, is the lack of viewing suffering and hardships in a light or in almost a godly perspective in a way, and finding good in them. Like even stoicism, like escaping chaos is to go, like to leave those, to control, to exit and just look inward, when looking at suffering or hardships. And I feel like, um, in my experience and in the Bible and what I read, like, um, sufferings can be used by God when we give them to Him, and we can find happiness and joy and peace and tranquility, and not just fleeting, but um, lasting happiness in our suffering when we look to God and we know we're following the way of Jesus. When um, we know that following His will is far greater, and will lead to far greater results than our will. Um, and knowing that that's far greater than us, knowing that that leads to far greater happiness and far greater results than anything we could ever do. Um, yeah, those are my thoughts, and my belief in the Christian view. Um, and this is my works cited, the two sources I use. So, um, hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was good. And that's a wrap on my last project.